January 16th, 2026. The sweltering morning air in Aguascalientes, Mexico, doesn't feel like the end of the world. It feels like a heavy, humid silence. For nearly 10 years, a man moved through these dusty streets like a shadow, a ghost, with 1,000 faces and no name. He was a whisper in the deep files of the FBI, a face on a 10 Most Wanted poster that had begun to yellow and curl at the edges. Back in 2016, in the quiet, wooded outskirts of Charlotte, North Carolina, a young woman's light was extinguished over a few $100s, a petty debt that became a cold-blooded death warrant. The man responsible didn't just run, he vanished into the jagged, lawless landscape of a completely different life. But justice has a long memory and a very cold heart. As the steel handcuffs finally clicked shut in the gray light of dawn, the decade-long game of cat and mouse reached its final move. The fugitive was no longer a ghost. He was Alejandro Rosales Castillo, and the bill for 2016 had finally come due. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Charlotte, North Carolina, is often described as a city of shimmering glass towers and quiet, oak-lined neighborhoods, a place where the American dream feels within reach for those willing to put in the hours. In the mid-2000s, this was the backdrop for the lives of Alejandro Rosales Castillo and Sandy Lay. To those who crossed their paths at a local Showmars restaurant where they both worked, they seemed like typical young adults navigating the early chapters of their independence. Alejandro, born in Arizona, but raised largely in the Charlotte area, was 20 years old in 2016. He was known to colleagues as a capable worker, though those who looked closer saw a young man who lived on the edge of his means, someone who craved a status his paycheck couldn't quite provide. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that bordered on arrogance, a trait that would later be reevaluated by investigators as the hallmark of a burgeoning sociopath. Sandy Lee, just 23, was a stark contrast in spirit. She was a woman defined by her kindness and a relentless work ethic. Her family described her as a pillar of support, someone who moved through life with a gentle grace but possessed a sharp mind for detail. She wasn't just working a job, she was building a future. Sandy was known for her generosity, often being the one to step in when a friend was in a financial bind. It was this very quality, her willingness to trust and her desire to help, that would ultimately place her in the crosshairs of a predator. The social circle at the restaurant was tight-knit, a common phenomenon in the service industry where long hours and shared stress forge quick bonds. Within this circle was another figure who would play a pivotal role in the coming tragedy: Amariba Feaster. Amariba, or Abby as she was known, was 19 and deeply entwined with Alejandro. Their relationship was volatile, fueled by a mutual desire for a lifestyle they couldn't afford and a shared sense of entitlement that frequently led them into murky waters. To the outside world, they were just another young couple, but behind closed doors, a darker dynamic was simmering. Alejandro was the dominant force, a manipulator who used Abby's devotion to anchor his own erratic impulses. The tension began not with a grand betrayal, but with something far more mundane: a debt. Alejandro had borrowed money from Sandy, a sum estimated to be around $1,000. In the grand scheme of a city like Charlotte, it was a pittance, but in the world of young adults living paycheck to paycheck, it was a significant weight. For Sandy, the money represented her hard-earned savings. For Alejandro, it was a constant reminder of a power dynamic he couldn't tolerate. He didn't see the loan as an act of kindness. He saw it as an obligation that shackled him to someone he considered an obstacle. As the summer of 2016 reached its peak, the atmosphere within the group began to shift. Alejandro's resentment wasn't hidden. It was a cold, creeping thing. He began to whisper to Abby about solutions to their financial problems, framing Sandy not as a friend, but as a creditor who was pressuring them. It was a classic manipulation tactic, dehumanizing the victim to justify the crime that was already taking shape in his mind. He wasn't just looking for a way to avoid paying her back. He was looking for a way to erase the debt and the person attached to it. Sandy, meanwhile, remained unaware of the darkness brewing. She continued to show up for her shifts, her wide smile a fixture of the restaurant. She believed in the best of people, trusting that the loan would be repaid when Alejandro got back on his feet. She didn't realize that every time she checked in on the status of the money, she was inadvertently tightening the noose Alejandro was preparing for her. The biography of Alejandro Castillo is not one of a man driven to madness by sudden tragedy, but of a man who systematically chose the path of least resistance, even when that path required the ultimate sacrifice from someone else. His history in the Charlotte area showed glimpses of this: minor brushes with the law, a tendency to vanish when things got difficult, and a pattern of using women to facilitate his lifestyle. By August 2016, he had reached a breaking point. He was broke, he was angry, and he had a partner in Abby who was willing to follow him into the abyss. The stage was set in the humid North Carolina woods, away from the glass towers and the bustling streets, where the veneer of regular guy Alejandro would finally drop, revealing the fugitive who would haunt the FBI for the next 10 years. Sandy Lay wasn't just a victim of a robbery, she was the victim of a man who decided his pride was worth more than her life. This was the environment of 2016, a mix of petty grievances and cold calculation that was about to explode into a headline that wouldn't find its period for a decade. The social ecosystem of a bustling restaurant like Shomar's often functions as a pressure cooker of personalities. Long hours spent in cramped quarters, the frantic rhythm of the lunch rush, and the shared exhaustion of the closing shift. For Sandy Lee, the restaurant was more than just a place of employment. It was a community. She was the kind of person who anchored that community, offering a stabilizing presence to the younger, more volatile employees. Among those younger co-workers were Alejandro Castillo and Amariba Abby Feaster. At first glance, the relationship between these three seemed built on the easy camaraderie of co-workers who had seen each other at their most stressed. They shared meals, traded stories about difficult customers, and eventually, the professional boundary blurred into a personal one. Sandy, with her natural inclination toward mentorship and support, took Alejandro under her wing. She saw a 20-year-old trying to find his footing, and when he spoke of financial struggles, she didn't hesitate to offer a solution. The loan was supposed to be a bridge, a temporary fix for a young man who couldn't quite make his ends meet. To Sandy, the $1,000 she handed over was a gesture of faith in a friend. She expected that, in time, Alejandro would honor that trust. However, the moment the money changed hands, the invisible architecture of their relationship shifted. Alejandro didn't feel gratitude. He felt the suffocating weight of an obligation he had no intention of fulfilling. In his mind, Sandy was no longer a friend or a co-worker. She was a predator, a constant reminder of his own perceived inadequacy and his lack of control. He began to view her check-ins regarding the money as acts of aggression, twisting her patience into a form of harassment. While Alejandro's resentment was festering, his relationship with Abby Feaster was becoming an echo chamber for his darkest impulses. Abby was deeply infatuated with Alejandro, drawn to his confidence and the sense of excitement he brought into her world. She was young, impressionable, and increasingly isolated from outside influences that might have tempered Alejandro's manipulation. Within the privacy of their relationship, Alejandro began to frame Sandy as a villain. He painted a picture of a woman who was pressuring them, who was making their lives difficult over a sum of money he felt he didn't truly owe. He used Abby's loyalty as a weapon, convincing her that Sandy's existence was a threat to their shared future. It was a masterful bit of psychological theater. He wasn't asking Abby to help him commit a crime, he was asking her to help him solve a problem that was hurting them both. As the summer of 2016 progressed, the three of them continued to inhabit the same physical spaces, but the psychological distance was growing vast. Sandy remained the same, steadfast, kind, and professional, unaware that she was being discussed in whispers during Alejandro and Abby's late-night conversations. To the other employees at Shomar's, nothing seemed amiss. They saw a group of friends who occasionally hung out outside of work. They didn't see the way Alejandro's eyes darkened when Sandy entered a room, or the way Abby began to mirror his coldness. The relationship had become a parasitic one, with Alejandro feeding on Abby's devotion to fuel a plan that was becoming increasingly concrete. Alejandro's manipulation of Abby was systematic. He didn't just tell her Sandy was a problem. He made Abby feel responsible for the solution. He tapped into her fears of losing him, suggesting that if they didn't get out from under this debt, they wouldn't be able to stay together. He began to talk about leaving Charlotte, about starting over somewhere else, perhaps Mexico, where he had family connections. But to do that, they needed money, and they needed to erase the obstacles holding them back. The problem of Sandy Love became the focal point of their shared reality. Alejandro convinced Abby that they were the victims in this scenario, and that any action they took was merely a form of self-defense against a world that was trying to keep them down. The dynamic between the two of them was a classic folie à deux, a shared delusion where the paranoia of one partner is adopted by the other. Alejandro provided the direction, and Abby provided the validation. They began to plan their exit strategy, and central to that plan was the final meeting with Sandy. Alejandro knew Sandy's routine. He knew her kindness would make her an easy target. He didn't need to force her into a trap. He only needed to invite her. He crafted a story about finally having the money to pay her back, a lie designed to appeal to her sense of relief and her desire to put the financial tension behind them. In the final weeks leading up to August, the trio's interactions were a masterclass in deception. Sandy, feeling that the end of the debt was in sight, was likely lighter, more at ease. She probably felt a sense of pride that her help had finally served its purpose. Alejandro and Abby, meanwhile, were operating in a state of hypervigilance, their every word and gesture calculated to maintain the facade of normalcy. They were no longer co-workers. They were actors in a play where the final act had already been written in blood. The meeting they were arranging wasn't a transaction, it was a transition. The moment Alejandro would move from being a debt-ridden restaurant worker to a cold-blooded killer on the run. The tragedy of Sandy Lou's relationship with Alejandro was that she never saw the predator behind the friend. She judged him by her own standards of loyalty and honesty, failing to realize that he operated by a completely different set of rules. While she was planning her future in Charlotte, Alejandro was planning her erasure. The debt, which to her was a simple matter of math and friendship, had become to him a matter of life and death. This block of time, the months spent in the daily grind of the restaurant, was the gestation period for a monster. It was here, amidst the smell of fried food and the clatter of dishes, that the decision was made. The relationship that had begun with a handshake and a loan would end in a desolate patch of woods, proving that sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones we shouldn't have trusted at all. The complexity of this dynamic is what makes the case so haunting. It wasn't a crime of passion, but a crime of convenience and ego. Alejandro didn't kill Sandy because he hated her in the traditional sense. He killed her because she was in his way. He killed her because he could, and because he had spent months convincing himself and his partner that it was the only logical choice. As the calendar turned to August 2016, the time for talking was over. The debt was about to be settled, but not in the way Sandy Le had ever imagined. The trap was set, the weapon was ready, and the two people she called friends were waiting for her in the shadows. The heat of a North Carolina August is a heavy, suffocating thing, a damp blanket of humidity that clings to everything and makes the air feel thick enough to taste. On Tuesday, August 9th, 2016, this oppressive atmosphere served as the backdrop for what was supposed to be a simple, long-awaited meeting. Sandy Lowe had every reason to believe that the day would mark the end of a frustrating chapter. After months of patience, Alejandro Castillo had finally reached out with the news she wanted to hear. He had the money. He told her he was ready to settle the debt, but he didn't want to do it at the restaurant or in a crowded public space. He suggested a meeting later that evening, framed as a way to finally put the tension behind them without the prying eyes of their co-workers. Sandy, ever the optimist and a woman who valued her word, agreed without hesitation. She didn't see the red flags in the odd timing or the shifting location. In her mind, this was a transaction of honor. She trusted Alejandro because they had shared shifts, shared jokes, and shared a workplace that felt like family. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows over Charlotte, Sandy got into her four-door 2003 Toyota Corolla and headed toward the designated meeting spot. She likely felt a sense of relief. The $1,000 was a significant sum, and having it back meant she could focus on her own plans for the future. What Sandy didn't know was that the meeting had been choreographed down to the minute. Alejandro wasn't alone. Amariba Abby Feaster was with him, acting as the silent witness and accomplice to a plan that had transitioned from a dark fantasy into a cold reality. Alejandro had secured a handgun, a .45 caliber pistol that he had acquired through his various peripheral connections. He hadn't brought it for protection. He had brought it to serve as the final arbiter of his debt. The two of them waited for Sandy, their own car positioned for a quick exit, their minds already miles away from the city they were about to leave in a state of shock. When Sandy arrived, the interaction began under the guise of normalcy. There was no immediate violence, no sudden outburst of rage. Alejandro was a master of the slow burn, maintaining the facade of a friend just long enough to ensure his victim was completely vulnerable. He convinced Sandy to leave her car and get into the vehicle with him and Abby. He told her they needed to go to a different location to pick up the cash, or perhaps he used the excuse of a final, friendly drive to clear the air. Sandy, trusting to a fault, stepped out of her Corolla, a car that would later become a grim landmark for investigators, and climbed into the back seat. The drive led them away from the flickering streetlights of the city and toward the dense, tangled woods of Cabarrus County. As the urban sprawl gave way to towering pines and gravel roads, the atmosphere inside the car must have shifted from strained, polite conversation into a terrifying silence. Alejandro drove with a singular purpose. He pulled off into a secluded area, a place where the sounds of the highway were muffled by the thick brush and the chorus of cicadas. This was the stage he had chosen, a place where no one would hear the confrontation and no one would see the betrayal. In the darkness of the woods, the mask finally slipped. There was no money. There was no intention of a peaceful resolution. Alejandro turned to Sandy, and the friend she thought she knew was replaced by a cold-eyed stranger holding a .45 caliber pistol. The details of the final moments remain a harrowing puzzle, but the forensic evidence later told a story of brutal efficiency. Sandy was shot in the head, a single devastating blow intended to end her life instantly. She didn't have a chance to plead, to run, or to fight back. In an instant, the woman who had spent years helping others was discarded like an unwanted piece of history. Alejandro didn't stop at the killing. With a chilling level of detachment, he and Abby moved to hide the evidence of their work. They dragged Sandy's body into a shallow ravine, covering her with brush and leaves in a hurried attempt to buy themselves time. There was no remorse shown in the aftermath. There was only the logistical problem of escape. They returned to Sandy's car, the Toyota Corolla, and drove it back toward the city, but they didn't leave it there. They needed to create a trail of breadcrumbs that led away from their true destination. The level of premeditation involved in the hours following the murder was staggering. Alejandro and Abby didn't just flee, they orchestrated a disappearance. They took Sandy's car, her phone, and her personal belongings. They drove the Corolla to a location where it wouldn't be immediately found, but would eventually suggest that Sandy had left of her own accord. Then, they turned their sights toward the south. They had a head start, a weapon, and a complete lack of a moral compass. As the morning of August 10th dawned, the Lowe family began to realize something was terribly wrong. Sandy hadn't returned home. She wasn't answering her phone. This was a woman who never missed a shift and never left her family wondering where she was. While her mother and siblings began the frantic process of calling hospitals and filing a missing persons report, Alejandro and Abby were already crossing state lines. They were fueled by adrenaline and the belief that they had successfully cleared the slate. The incident wasn't just the pull of a trigger, it was the total collapse of a social contract. Alejandro Castillo had traded the life of a friend for a few $100s and his own bruised ego. He had used the trust built over countless restaurant shifts to lure a woman to her death. In the quiet woods of Cabarrus County, the ground held a secret that would take days to uncover, while the man responsible for it was already barreling toward the Mexican border. Sandy Lou's death was an act of profound cowardice, a solution born from the mind of a man who refused to take responsibility for his own life. By the time the sun set on August 10th, the investigation was in its infancy, but the damage was absolute. A young woman was gone, a family was broken, and two fugitives were vanishing into the vastness of the American highway system. Alejandro Castillo had committed the ultimate act of betrayal, and in doing so, he had signed his own name to the FBI's most wanted list. The woods were silent again, but the echoes of that Tuesday night would eventually reverberate across two countries for the next decade. The cold calculation of Day X revealed the true nature of the man the FBI would spend millions of dollars to find. He wasn't a criminal mastermind, he was a petty man with a gun who mistook violence for power. As he drove toward the border, he likely thought he had won. He didn't realize that by ending Sandy Lou's story, he had ensured that his own would be defined by the hunt. The humid air of the North Carolina woods held the truth, waiting for the search parties that were already beginning to form, driven by the love of a family that refused to let Sandy simply vanish into the night. When the morning of Wednesday, August 10th arrived, the Lou household was not filled with the usual sounds of a family readying themselves for the day. Instead, it was draped in an unsettling, heavy silence. Sandy Lou was a creature of habit, a woman whose reliability was as much a part of her identity as her smile. She never missed a shift at Shomar's, and she never, under any circumstances, spent a night away from home without a flurry of text messages and phone calls to ensure her mother and siblings knew she was safe. By 8 a.m., that silence had curdled into a cold, sharp panic. Her phone went straight to voicemail, a sound that would eventually become the haunting soundtrack of the next several days. The family's initial search was frantic and grassroots. They called friends, co-workers, and anyone who might have seen her the night before. The name Alejandro Castillo came up almost immediately. Everyone knew Sandy had gone to meet him to collect the debt. When the family reached out to Alejandro and Abby Feaster, they were met with a wall of practiced indifference. The couple claimed that Sandy had never shown up, or that they had met briefly, and she had driven away alone. It was a lie, but at that moment, it served its purpose. It sowed just enough doubt to keep the family spinning in circles for a few precious hours. By that afternoon, the La family had filed a formal missing persons report with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. Initially, the case was treated with the standard caution applied to adults who go missing. People sometimes leave of their own volition. They sometimes need a break from their lives. But Sandy's family refused to accept this narrative. They knew Sandy. They knew her car, a distinctive 2003 Toyota Corolla, was as missing as she was. They began a social media blitz, plastering her photo across every local group and news outlet, their desperation acting as a catalyst for a community that had grown to love the young woman. As the days ticked by, the investigation took a dark turn. On Saturday, August 13th, the search for Sandy Lou moved from the neighborhoods of Charlotte to the scorching asphalt of Phoenix, Arizona. A 2003 Toyota Corolla matching the description of Sandy's vehicle had been discovered in an airport parking lot. It was locked, abandoned, and seemingly scrubbed of any immediate clues. The location was a punch to the gut for the investigators and the family. Phoenix was more than 2,000 miles away from Charlotte, a distance that suggested Sandy hadn't just gone for a drive. It suggested a calculated, long-distance flight. While the car was being processed by forensic teams in Arizona, the detectives back in North Carolina were digging into the lives of Alejandro Castillo and Abby Feaster. They found that the couple had vanished at the same time Sandy did. Their social media went dark, their phones were disconnected, and their apartment was empty. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a terrifying picture of a pre-planned escape. The focus shifted from a missing person to a double fugitive hunt, but the most important question remained: where was Sandy? The answer came on August 17, 2016, in a way that shattered any remaining hope the Lou family held. Acting on tips and a renewed focus on the wooded areas of Cabarrus County, search teams moved into a desolate patch of forest near the town of Midland. The searchers weren't looking for a living person anymore. They were looking for disturbed earth. In a shallow ravine, partially obscured by the heavy summer growth and a layer of discarded brush, they found the remains. It was Sandy. The discovery turned the missing persons case into a homicide investigation. The medical examiner's report was a brutal confirmation of the family's worst fears: a single gunshot wound to the head. There was no evidence of a struggle, no signs that Sandy had seen the end coming. She had been executed and discarded. The cruelty of the act, the fact that she had been left in the dirt while her friends used her car to flee the state, sent a wave of revulsion through the Charlotte community. The search for Sandy had ended, but the search for her killers was just beginning. The discovery of the body galvanized the FBI, who officially joined the hunt. They realized that by the time the body was found, Alejandro and Abby had a nearly week-long head start. Surveillance footage from the Phoenix airport showed the couple, but they hadn't boarded a plane. Instead, they had used the airport as a diversion before heading toward the Mexican border. They were seen on camera crossing into Mexico at the Nogales port of entry just 2 days after the murder. For the Liu family, the search for Sandy was replaced by an agonizing wait for justice. They had to bury a daughter and a sister while knowing that the men who took her life were likely thousands of miles away, shielded by an international border and a vast, unfamiliar country. The community of Charlotte rallied around them, holding vigils and raising funds, but the void left by Sandy was absolute. She was no longer a face on a poster. She was a memory, a victim of a betrayal so profound it defied logic. The search phase of the case revealed the chilling efficiency of Alejandro Castillo's plan. He had used the time it took to find the car and the body to put thousands of miles between himself and the crime scene. He had exploited the natural delays of the legal system to vanish into the shadows of Mexico. The investigation was now an international game of high-stakes hide-and-seek, with the FBI's Charlotte field office taking the lead. They knew they weren't just looking for a common criminal. They were looking for a man who had successfully navigated an escape across an entire continent. The psychological toll on the search teams was immense. Many of the officers had spent days hoping for a different outcome, only to find themselves standing in a ravine in Cabarrus County, looking at the cost of a $1,000 debt. The case had become personal for the city. It wasn't just about a murder, it was about the safety of a community where co-workers are supposed to be friends. The search for Sandy Liu had ended in tragedy, but it had ignited a flame of determination that would not go out for the next decade. The FBI began the arduous process of placing Alejandro Castillo on the 10 most wanted list, a designation reserved for the worst of the worst. They knew that without the public's help and the cooperation of international authorities, the trail would grow cold. As the summer of 2016 faded into autumn, the posters went up in post offices and police stations across the country. The face of the 20-year-old restaurant worker was now a symbol of a manhunt that would span years, borders, and administrations. The search for Sandy was over, but the world was now looking for the man who left her in the woods. The transition from a local murder investigation to an international manhunt occurred with a clinical, chilling speed. Once Sandy Liu's body was recovered from the shallow grave in Cabarrus County, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department realized the scope of the task ahead. They weren't just looking for a local runaway, they were pursuing a man who had successfully crossed an international border before the crime was even fully realized. On October 24, 2016, a federal arrest warrant was issued for Alejandro Rosales Castillo, charging him with unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. This elevated the case to the federal level, bringing the full weight and resources of the Federal Bureau of Investigation into the fold. By 2017, the investigation had reached a stalemate. Despite the recovery of the Toyota Corolla in Phoenix and the identification of Castillo and Feaster on surveillance footage at the border, the trail in Mexico had grown maddeningly cold. Alejandro was not a novice when it came to the geography of northern Mexico. He had family ties in the state of Guanajuato and knew how to navigate the linguistic and cultural nuances of the region to remain invisible. Recognizing that Castillo represented a particularly calculated and dangerous brand of criminal, one who would kill a friend over a petty financial dispute. The FBI took the rare step of adding him to their 10 most wanted fugitives list on October 24, 2017. He was the 516th person to be placed on the list, and a reward of up to $100,000 was offered for information leading to his arrest. The 10 most wanted designation changed the nature of the hunt. It wasn't just about boots on the ground in Charlotte anymore. It was about global awareness. Posters featuring Castillo's youthful face, his dark hair, his slight frame, and the small mole under his left eye were distributed across the United States and Mexico. The FBI worked closely with the legal attaché office in Mexico City, coordinating with Mexican federal authorities to narrow down his possible locations. They knew he was likely working under an alias, possibly in the service industry or construction, melting into the labor force of central Mexico. For the Liu family, this period marked the beginning of a grueling psychological war of attrition. Every time the FBI released a new update or a cold case segment aired on national television, their hopes would surge, only to be met with the crushing silence of another dead end. They had to watch the years go by, 2018, 2019, 2020, while Sandy's room remained a frozen monument to a life cut short. The injustice was a physical weight. While Sandy lay in a cemetery in North Carolina, her killer was breathing the air of a free man, perhaps even starting a new life under a different name. The thought that he might never face a courtroom became a recurring nightmare for her siblings and mother. The investigation, however, never truly went dormant. Behind the scenes, the FBI was monitoring every possible lead. They tracked pings from social media accounts that might have belonged to Castillo's associates. They interviewed distant relatives who claimed to have seen him at family gatherings in Mexico. They followed up on sightings in bus stations and border towns. There were moments of intense activity, raids on small apartments in Guanajuato or San Luis Potosí that yielded nothing but empty rooms and frustrated agents. The long hunt was a series of near misses and linguistic barriers, a game of chess played across two different legal systems. As the hunt entered its 5th, then its 8th year, the profile of the case shifted. Alejandro was no longer the 20-year-old boy who worked at a restaurant. He was now a man in his late 20s, his appearance likely altered by time and the stress of a life on the run. The FBI released age-progressed photos, attempting to predict how the fugitive might look as he aged. They focused on his habits, his love for soccer, his affinity for certain types of music, hoping that a small, human detail would be the key to his undoing. The breakthrough didn't come from a grand betrayal or a high-tech satellite trace. It came from the relentless, grinding pressure of international cooperation and a community that refused to forget Sandy Liu. Over the years, the reward stayed active, and the FBI's Charlotte field office maintained a constant dialogue with Mexican authorities. They were waiting for Castillo to make a mistake, to get too comfortable, to reach out to the wrong person, or to let his guard down in a city where he felt safe. That mistake finally materialized in early 2026. The intelligence began to point toward the city of Aguascalientes, a hub in central Mexico, known for its colonial architecture and bustling industry. Investigators received information that a man matching Castillo's description, though living under a meticulously crafted alias, was residing in a quiet residential neighborhood. The FBI and the Mexican Attorney General's Office, FGR, began a period of intense surveillance. They needed to be certain. They couldn't afford another empty room raid. They watched the man's movements, his interactions, and his routine, waiting for the moment they could confirm his identity beyond a shadow of a doubt. On the morning of January 16, 2026, the long hunt reached its crescendo. In a coordinated operation between Mexican federal agents and the FBI, the man who had been a shadow for nearly 10 years was cornered. There was no high-speed chase, no dramatic shootout in the streets of Aguascalientes. Instead, there was the sudden, overwhelming presence of law enforcement and the realization that the game was over. When the agents confronted him, they didn't address him by his alias. They used the name he hadn't heard in a decade, Alejandro. The capture sent a shockwave back to Charlotte. For 10 years, the city had carried the scar of Sandy Liu's murder, a reminder that some crimes go unpunished for far too long. When the news reached the Lay family on that Friday morning, the reaction wasn't one of celebration, but of profound, bone-deep relief. The long hunt had ended. The fugitive was in custody. The FBI's 10 most wanted list had one less name on it, and a family in North Carolina finally had the one thing they had been denied since a Tuesday night in August 2016: the prospect of a trial. The investigation now shifted into its final phase: extradition. The legal maneuvers required to bring a high-profile fugitive across the border were complex, but the determination of the U.S. government was absolute. They had spent a decade looking for Castillo. They weren't going to let a single procedural error jeopardize his return. As Castillo sat in a Mexican holding cell, the reality of his situation began to set in. The borders he had used as a shield were now the gates through which he would be marched back to face the consequences of a $1,000 debt and a cold-blooded execution. The investigation and the long hunt was a testament to the fact that while a criminal can run, they can never truly outpace the memory of their victims or the persistence of those sworn to find them. The trial, which commenced in the summer of 2026, became a focal point for a community that had never forgotten the events of August 2016. The prosecution laid out a devastatingly clear timeline, using forensic evidence from the woods of Cabarrus County and digital footprints recovered from the Toyota Corolla found in Phoenix. They painted a picture of a man driven by a chillingly petty motive: a refusal to repay a $1,000 loan to a woman who had shown him nothing but kindness. The most emotional moment of the proceedings came when Sandy's mother and siblings took the stand, their voices steady but laced with a decade of grief, describing the void her absence had left in their lives. Throughout the testimony, Castillo remained largely impassive, his face a mask of indifference that only served to highlight the cold-blooded nature of the crime. When the jury finally returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, the courtroom remained silent, the weight of the moment transcending the need for outburst. The judge's sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole was more than just a punishment. It was a final, ironclad resolution. The man who had spent 10 years running from a debt had finally been forced to pay it in full, not in cash, but in the currency of his own freedom. The case of Alejandro Rosales Castillo stands as a haunting reminder that while the shadow of a fugitive may be long, it is never infinite. The 10 years he spent in the sun of Mexico were not a victory, but a stay of execution. A decade where every siren and every stranger's glance carried the weight of the woods in Cabarrus County. Justice, though delayed by borders and bureaucracy, proved to be as relentless as the family that refused to let Sandy Lou's name fade into a cold case file. Today, the 10 Most Wanted poster is gone, replaced by a finality that echoes through the streets of Charlotte. Sandy Lou is no longer defined by the debt she was owed, but by the peace that was finally won in her name. The long hunt is over. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.